During 2005, two different racing games were released for the PS2, Gran Turismo 4 and Enthusia. While one has reached a legendary status, the other one has become a niche cult classic. What makes these games so special? That's what I will answer today, with a twist. I am playing these games with my Logitech G29, so I will also describe how they feel through a force feedback wheel setup. Let's begin with the one we all know and love. Gran Turismo 4 was released in December 28, 2004 for the Japanese market after multiple delays. A GT game without delays isn't a GT game now, is it? With the US and Europe following in February and March respectively, the previous release of the franchise, Gran Turismo 3, presented a massive leap as Polyphony unleashed the power of their new platform, the PS2. However, when compared to the previous release of the franchise, Gran Turismo 2, it felt like a step back regarding car and track selection, returning to similar numbers of the first Gran Turismo. With GT4, all the aspects that make the franchise were finally combined under a single game. The excellent graphics, which probably are among the best of its console generation, with each car model still holding quite well, especially when playing through an emulator today, which is impressive given how many cars GT4 has, 729 to be exact, with 80 different manufacturers. Well, this is a bit controversial. See, those 729 cars aren't individually different. There are many cars that share the same models, and while it's nice to have different year models for the sake of historical value, it's not the best way to create a car roster, given most of these differences between models are lost in the game. And to make it worse, for those who play previous games of the franchise, most of these cars aren't new, at least for me. I started with Gran Turismo 2, which I still believe has the best car roster out of them all, as it felt more balanced. With 4, the scales tip towards Japanese cars a bit too hard, as there are few new cars from other countries, something to consider rather than criticize. Another aspect where GT4 surprises even to this day is the massive amount of tracks, with staples of sim racing like Les Arts and the Nürburgring, other icons such as Tsukuba or Suzuka, and how can I forget Laguna Seca, which are joined by a variety of original tracks created by Polyphony, which are iconic in their own right. A big combination of fun tracks paired with an almost endless selection of cars isn't a common feat in racing games, but GT4 remains unbeaten in one simple area, gameplay. We start with enough cash to buy a used car and an empty garage, which builds over time, as different cars are required to enter other races. That's the excuse we all tell ourselves anyway. The way GT is structured means that every playthrough can be different. I have played countless times, and even to this day there are cars that I haven't touched yet. This also provides different approaches towards completion. One can bring the most OP car they can get away with and breeze through the events, or they can make every event an individual challenge by bringing a slower car. Sadly, there's a catch, as most races tend to be short and you might find yourself unable to close the gaps in time to win the race. It's normal to find yourself on second place, only to realize you only needed an extra lap to get first place. In events with more laps, where tire wear and fuel consumption enter into play, there are a lot more options to play around with strategy. While tire wear has been a feature since the very first GT, the fourth game added fuel consumption as well, giving an element of strategy to these races. Another thing which makes the racing experience bittersweet is the AI. They often ignore you, which leads to some awkward situations. It's difficult to have a clean battle in this game, and I don't blame those who don't want to get anywhere near the AI, but it's not impossible to have good races. It only takes some time playing with different cars to find the right combination of challenging and competitive pace. I recommend trying to play 4 races against the AI. It's an excellent excuse to try cars that you might have never driven before. It's this variety in gameplay that still places GT4 as the gold standard, even today, where even Polyphony themselves can seem to leave this title behind them. But how does it feel to play this game through an FFP steering wheel? The steering doesn't feel too heavy, with lighter FFP than modern games. Still, I think it's adequate, as it's enough to be enjoyable. Sure, when you turn the wheel, you can feel some weight, but you don't really feel what the car is doing. It's very strange, but there's very little or next to no information coming through the wheel. You just turn and the car goes. I can't tell if I'm going to overshoot the turn or not, personally. Well, I know because I can see, but by then it's a bit too late anyway. It's funny to see your car sliding around the track and yet the wheel doesn't respond to anything. It's not interested in GT4. The best way to imagine GT4 is picturing a sim racing game without physics coming through the FFP wheel. There's force, but that's all you can really feel. There's no weight transfer or anything, despite this feature being present in the game. Cars tend to feel similar regarding their drivetrain. Of course, their limitations are still represented, but they don't come through the wheel at least. So yes, cars still experience understeer or oversteer depending on your inputs. It's funny because the wheel has enough weight to feel right while turning, but you quickly realize something is off. You can clip off the grass and lose control without the ability to correct, and the wheel stays still. Another thing that's strange are the bumps. My god, they are pretty strong when compared to the rest of everything coming through the wheel, to the point where you can't control your car as the steering tends to lock with each bump. Rally stages are unfriendly to the wheel, which bumps and knocks about constantly. Better to stay in tarmac really. Despite being a bit strange, GT4 with a wheel isn't a bad experience. It is pretty fun most of the time. It's clearly orientated towards controller players and it still feels like a video game. Don't expect a fully fledged simulator here. Wheel support is an extra, and it feels that way. It's a nice curiosity, but I think it might be better to play with a controller most of the time. For those curious, these are my settings. I would like to hear your thoughts on it too. Was your experience with a wheel the same as mine? So, what about Enthusia? It released in March 2005 for the Japanese market and May 2005 for the Western world, which placed it close to GT4's release for its disgrace. It was impossible to avoid comparisons for Konami's first racing game. Reviews were negative, but they didn't hesitate to establish GT4 as the superior game. But is this really the case? Enthusia isn't a copy of GT. If anything, one of its scenes is trying too hard to be different. Let me explain. Its career mode, called Enthusia Life, is like nothing you ever seen before. There's no licenses here. Enthusia's main progression is ruled by a ranking system, where we start at number 1000 and the objective is reaching number 1. Basic enough, right? See, in order to reach lower ranking numbers, you have to race. I know, what a shock. Each race provides a set amount of points, and these points are then placed in a 12-week ranking system carried by the game itself, where your 9 best point scores are used to calculate your ranking, which means your scores have to be better and better in order to progress. This presents a small problem as you climb through the ranks and races get harder. If you change cars and try to race in the higher ranking events, you will struggle, because these cars need upgrades, which can only be acquired through racing. This forces you to participate in lower ranking events, which give less points, which will cause your overall ranking to drop, creating a situation where changing cars isn't a good idea. But then again, given how cars are unlocked, that might be for the best. Oh god, here we go. In Enthusia, you don't buy cars or win them after specific races. Nope, you unlock them through a lottery after each race. All you can do is hope for the best and pray it lands on a car that you might actually want. I think now everyone can see why Enthusia tries too hard to be different. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Take this approach, it really works. I understand trying new things and I do value the intention, but in this case, it creates a career mode which can only be described as tedious. Fair enough, if I am talking about it, then it does something well, right? Yes, it does. First of all, the car selection, while smaller than GT4's and with a few familiar faces from it, manages to present all sorts of cars to enjoy, from desirable exotics that GT should have by now, like the Lancia 37. Also, I just realized that GT4 has the 190 Evo and Enthusia has the E30 M3. Will be nice to have them together in a game. So it does feature a few cars that might pique your interest, and it doesn't disappoint with the usual Japanese quirky cars we all grown to love, and they actually sound like cars. Unfortunately, there's no tire wear or fuel consumption mechanics. I suppose it's a trade-off. Another area where it drops the ball is the track selection. It's rather limited compared to GT4 and it only features 2 real tracks, the Cuba and the Nürburgring, which you can drive in reverse, totally not having nightmares tonight. While Enthusia stands out thanks to its driving physics, it responds well with the steering wheel. First of all, there's a heavy and dare I say it exaggerated focus on weight transfer. It dominates the driving experience and it demands careful, fine driving, as being too aggressive will end up with a spin or against the wall, the usual affair. It takes some time before you can get used to its handling, especially with rear-wheel drive cars, even more if they are older. If you treat these cars with care, you'll get around fine, but it never manages to feel natural through the wheel. Odds are, in order to make these cars more controllable, you'll be running very soft suspension setups. Maybe it's me, so I'm not going to blame the game for my lack of skill, but it's difficult to correct slides. You don't feel much until the car snaps on you, and by then it's too late. Trying to countersteer usually ends up with the car swinging around as well, as it's hard to pinpoint how much you have to steer in order to correct. The best method is not spinning. But really, the best method I found is to play with throttle and brake inputs, given how important it is to nail weight transfer. I can understand this issue as steering wheel and pedal setups were very rare back then, and most people playing this game used a controller, so it wasn't viable to tweak everything towards wheel users. Then again, I do advise caution if you try Enthusia with a controller, as it's harder than GT and very unforgiving, but it has better physics than GT4, that's for sure. In part, I think the reason why Enthusia proves to be so tricky to grasp isn't down to physics, but down to the AI. Let me explain. The AI in this game is very aggressive. They aren't afraid to make contact with you or send their car in a way that will make Max Verstappen cringe. It's common to find them on spaces where there's no room to pass, and yet they have the audacity to push you off the turn. Races in this game can be pretty dirty, which makes for a pretty unhealthy environment to learn its quirks. To make it worse, a feature of its career mode is called Enthusia Points, which acts like a health bar, yeah, in a racing game. God, I need whatever they were smoking at Konami now. If you make contact with other cars, crash into walls or leave the track, this bar will start to lower. Once it reaches 0, you can't race for an entire week, which is really bad for your ranking. So now you have to put up with a complex physics engine, aggressive opponents, new track layouts, and avoiding any sort of contact, like Twitter avoids a fair debate. Here's why I think Enthusia is better enjoyed with a complete save game, which already has everything unlocked, rather than playing through its career. Unlike GT4 with its entertaining career mode, the driving force in Enthusia comes through its driving physics. Anything else is a distraction from the main dish, so do yourself a favor and try this game with a complete save game. Go crazy driving whatever you like, the game has a few interesting cars. It's a bit sad that we never got to see anything else from this team, which is a pretty impressive effort. That's why most criticisms I have could have been fixed in future releases, but sadly this is all we got, and I can't judge a product based on what ifs. Despite all, Enthusia is a decent game that deserves to be visited at least once. So, these two games are interesting cases. In one, GT4 has managed to become a staple of racing games for its endless content aimed towards realism. Most of us have learned the basics of driving thanks to Gran Turismo, as I explained on my previous video, and for many, this is their holy grail, and I don't blame them. It's one of my favorite games as well, but I also have to say, Enthusia feels like a prototype of what racing games will become over the years, with a smaller car selection and focused instead on realistic physics with the support of force feedback steering wheels. I can't help but wonder how this game will fare today if it wasn't for its terrible career mode. Both are special games that deserve to be played if you have any sort of interest in cars. And if you enjoyed this video, do leave a like and suggestions on which games I should play next. With that said, it's time for us to wrap this up. Look after yourself. Until next time.